Welcome back to my channel, Practicing Photography. My name is Doug Gabbard, and I'm going to show you some secrets to understanding the exposure triangle. Triangle is nice, but it can be a bit confusing. So let's get right to it. If you stick with me to the end of the video, I do have something to share with you that will help you out. So let's see what the next slide is about. The next slide talks about the exposure triangle. It doesn't talk about it, it just shows a picture of it. It shows aperture right here, shows shutter over here, and ISO down here. What it doesn't really tell you is how they impact each other. There are some things in here that I'm not going to get into the depth of why these images change here, and I'll reference it on the shutter speed and aperture when we get into it a little bit, but that's another video for another day. So let's throw this triangle away since it's a little bit confusing. So we're going to go to my slide called exposure sliders. This is how I understand exposure triangles. It's not a triangle whatsoever, it's sliders. So here's an aperture slider, shutter speed slider, and the ISO slider, just like the exposure triangle before, except they're on horizontal lines and you can relate to them. We have a green line going through the middle. We don't want to move the green line when we're playing with this to understand the exposure triangle or the exposure that you're dealing with. But let's say we're going to go watch our child or grandchild play soccer, and we set up our camera and it looks like f5.6 and 1/25th of a second and 100. If you shoot an auto, maybe that's what it comes up to. So you flip it to manual and you want to understand how to do those settings. So first thing you want to understand is, what is a stop? So a stop is either having or doubling the amount of light that's coming into your camera. And you can change each one on one stop by adjusting the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO. And I put the stops in just random place, but each one of these, f2 to 2.8 is one stop, 2.8 to f4 is one stop, and so on. Shutter speed of 15th of a second to a 30th of a second is one stop. 100 to 200 ISO is one stop. Now you notice a nice, easy, even number change here. It's doubling each time. Same thing with shutter speed. The math to figure out aperture, don't even do it. It makes my brain hurt. Just trust that the change from f11 even to f16 doesn't look like it's double. It is. So we've taken our first picture on auto, and we can see f5.6 and 1.25 or 1/125th of a second, and 100 for our ISO setting. So you're going to take your pictures. So we want a faster shutter speed that'll freeze or stop the action. That's what you need for a fast-moving player or a fast-moving car or something like that. The race car may be even faster. So 1/25th of a second may not be fast enough to freeze the action. So let's move the shutter speed 2 stops to 1/500th of a second. So when we do that, now you'll notice I moved my shutter speed slider over 2 stops. And when I did, I need to compensate for that. So when you look at what you did to compensate for that, I moved my f-stop from 5.6 to 2.8. I moved it down 2 stops. That worked great. So we're happy, aren't we? Well, we look at our photos when we get home, and maybe it's not what we expected. So we do stop or freeze because we're at 1/500th of a second. And your player is pretty much in focus. But that's it. Nothing else is in focus. If that's what you want, great. Awesome, you're done. Good example. Look at this picture on this slide. The soccer ball is sharp. The netting in front of it is blurry. The netting in the back of it is also blurry. And that was an impact that they wanted. They wanted a sharp soccer ball, but they want the foreground and background out of focus a little bit to emphasize the ball. So f2.8 probably was pretty good for that shot. But maybe you want a little bit more focus around your player than this soccer picture shows. So here we are. We're still got our 2 stops on our shutter speed that we did, but we still need to compensate for two stops of light. So we can do that by adjusting the aperture and the ISO 1 stop each. That also will compensate for the 2 stops that we moved on shutter speed. Pretty easy to do. So you kind of get the idea of what we're doing here. And you can see the relation between aperture and shutter speed. If you move one, you can move the other. And if you don't want to move either one of those, you can move the ISO. So take your pick. So as I said at the beginning, there's different impacts of moving the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. There's pluses and minuses when you move one over the other. So what I'm after here is how much light's coming in or going out of light, not my depth of field, not so much freezing, other than that's my my purpose of this slide is I gave you a freezing soccer player, or the noise that you might introduce with different ISOs. That's a whole different YouTube video. So as I said here, we had to compensate for 2 stops. We moved the aperture up 1 stop and our ISO up 1 stop to allow us to get more light. So this slide is just a nice cleaner image in case you want to print it out so that you can have this for reference. So where can you find me? You can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Twitter. I've got a blog, and I'll have an accompanying blog to this video that says pretty much the same thing, maybe a little bit shorter write-up, but we'll have the same slide deck. And of course, my YouTube channel called Practicing Photography that you just found. So if you like this, please hit the like and the subscribe button so you can help me find out if I need to keep doing these, and let me know what you think. And as I promised at the beginning, if you stayed to the end, I was going to offer you something. If you look down below in the comments, there will be a link to the PDF of this presentation. Grab it, it's free. It's for you to use. It's great use for a photography club. If you're in a photography club, you can share this with your club. Have a great day. Thanks for watching me on Practicing Photography.